Well, hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rural, y'all. This week, we are talking with Carly Heath, the author of The Reckless Kind. Carly earned her bachelor's from San Francisco State University and her MFA from Chapman University. She's originally from the San Francisco Bay Area and teaches design, art, theater, and writing for various colleges and universities. She spends all her time and most of her money tending to a menagerie of rescued farm animals. The Reckless Kind has garnered enthusiastic reviews, including a starred review from BCCB for its nuanced depiction of queer and disabled identities. So welcome, Carly. So good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on the channel and the podcast. I'm so excited to be here.
Okay, so the first question that I always ask everyone, because I am obsessed with where people have come from and how it impacts their writing, is to have you just talk a little bit about your background and how you feel like that has shaped who you are as both a person and a writer.
Yeah, I grew up in the rural area outside of the San Francisco Bay Area in an unincorporated part of Contra Costa County called, well, the town was called Clayton, but we lived beyond the Clayton border in the Morgan Territory area, which is kind of at the base of Mount Diablo. And we had a 5-acre ranch. It was a very rural area. We had a lot of horses and goats and chickens and rabbits, and I was involved in 4-H and 4-H, learning about how people raise animals really ignited a lot of my interest in animal rights and animal activism. And I kind of owe 4-H to turning me into an animal rights activist. And I became heavily involved in animal rescue after that. And I have now, so kind of continuing my background growing up in rural Contra Costa County. I now live in a city, and I have 3 sheep that I've rescued, and I also have a bunny that I've rescued, and I help take care of some other rescue animals. There's some pigs here, and I have my rescue horse as well, and so I'm very much involved in animals. I also lived for a little while in rural Nebraska. And I lived in a town, while I was writing this book, actually, I lived in a town called Chadron, Nebraska, and I still teach for the college there. But to give people an idea of how far out in the middle of nowhere this is, you had to go 110 miles to your nearest Starbucks. And that kind of out in the middle of nowhere, with a lot of farming and all of that was really interesting to me, because though I grew up in a rural part of Contra Costa County, it's still, you drive 30 minutes and there's school there, and there's all of the shopping and everything that is in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that was a little bit even more different than me. But so yeah, I would say growing up in the rural community really inspired my love of animals. I've always heavily been involved with horses and done every type of horse equestrian activity that there is to do, whether it's dressage or endurance or jumping or barrel racing. Did all of that, and very into farriery, which is a part of this book as well. Farriery, which is the taking care of horses' hooves, whether trimming or shoeing. My sister's a veterinarian, and my twin sister, actually, and she's very involved in agriculture reform and reforming the agricultural industry. She's a small animal vet and works a lot with rescues as well, and doing farm animal rescue.
That's awesome. Melissa White and I kind of talked about this too a little bit, the sort of spectrum of rural and remote there is, because there are rural sort of urban places where urban sprawl starts to overlap, but there are still definitely rural people who live there. Then I kind of was the 30 minutes from everywhere type of rural, where like if you needed to go to the store, it was 20 to 30 minutes, depending on, if it was harvest season or not,
Yeah.
Unless you wanted to go to the good mall. If you wanted to go to the good mall, then it was like an hour and a half.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like there's just this like spectrum and range of the different kinds of rural that exist. And I think that your background and your story demonstrates that beautifully. And I think it's important that people continue to recognize that, because if we just have one picture of what rural looks like, then we're sort of like missing the richness and beauty of what, happens in rural places.
Yeah, there's a huge diversity. And like even in Nebraska, which was way more rural than what I grew up with, it was still a college town. So there was a college there. And so there was a lot of diversity in the student body. Mm-hmm. And you could interact with people from all over, even people from Kenya and Ethiopia. And so there was that, and there was like this international group of students. But then there's also during the summertime when everyone goes home, it definitely feels like a very, very, very small town. And so that's really interesting as well.
That's really interesting.
And shout out to Chadron. I love Chadron, but Chadron State College is so inexpensive, and it's a really great college that no one knows about. And the faculty there is fantastic, and the education students receive is fantastic. And so I really love it. It's a perfect example of you don't need to go to, a big city to get a really good quality education. So if you're looking for an inexpensive place to get your education, definitely check out Chadron.
That's a really great recommendation. Thank you so much for sharing. You mentioned in your response that you were writing this novel while living in Nebraska. And one of the things that is really fascinating to me is the place of the novel, right? And thinking about how people tell stories and how people research stories, and to think about like how you craft a place when you're not living in that place. So can you talk a little bit about that process and what that was like for you in writing the book?
Yeah, the book takes place in a fictional Scandinavian country that's west of Norway. And it's heavily inspired by my love of Scandinavia ever since I was like a middle schooler, pretty much. I just thought Norway was like the most fascinating place. And my favorite breed of horse was the Norwegian fjord horse. So I had tons of Horse Illustrated and Equus magazines that had all the, the articles on the Norwegian fjord horse. And so I always wanted to make a book that centered that breed of horse in it. And I kind of had the story really brewing in my head for so long, being kind of an active horse kid and a active just kid in general. I had a lot of accidents, which accidents are a theme in the book. I broke my arm really, really bad one summer in middle school, or no, it was actually the beginning of high school. And being in a rural community, I had my arm like flapping backwards. It was really bad break, and had to wait for so long for the ambulance to get there. So and in so much pain. And that triggers, I think, a lot of ideas in your head about what is this like for someone who lives at the turn of the century when there aren't ambulances like this, when you really start to think about a lot of things like that. And I actually then finally, like, the spark that, like, I was like, I'm gonna write this book. I had this idea. What came when I read Kristin Lavransdatter, which is by Sigrid Undset. It's the book that she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Gosh, it was the Nobel Prize for Literature. For basically for that book, although you don't win for like a specific book, but that book kind of like inspired that. And it's a book set in Norway in the medieval times, and it's just a I love the book for the characters and the passion, but I wasn't a big fan of the message, which is basically if you defy your parents, you'll suffer. And so I'm like, I kind of like wanted everything about Kristen Lavransdatter, my love for Norwegian horses, my like fascination with Norway, and all of like my experience with horses, growing up with horses, to kind of all kind of came together, and I just then started just writing the book. And those who read the book will see that the Fuglestad family is a family that kind of takes in the unwanted horses that no one else wants, but because of that, they suffer a lot of accidents and injuries. And I wrote this during a time in my life where I kept getting injured by horses over and over again, and as it happens. And whenever it happens, you think about like, wow, if it weren't for modern medicine, where would I be right now? And so head injuries are a theme that come up, which is something that horse people have a lot of experience with. And yeah, when you're growing up with horses, the thing that they tell you over and over and over again is don't wrap the reins around your hands. And even with I've still had that injury, because you could break your fingers, you could break your hand, and we've heard the terrible stories just in the equestrian circles of people losing their arm or badly mangling their arm because of doing that. And interestingly, like, yeah, while I was writing this, I also had an experience where the reins were wrapped around my hand and I broke my finger, and now my finger is like this. Okay. So I think horse people will see some things and go, oh yes, I'm very familiar with that type of injury.
And for me, it's interesting. There are like horse rural people, and then there are people like my family who are like, we don't use them for plowing anymore, and so we don't keep them because they're just expensive pets.
They are extremely expensive pets. Yes.
Yeah. And I even lived across the street from a saddlery for a while when I was growing up, and I would just stare across the fence and like look at the horses, and I just wanted to go over there so bad, and I wanted to like take lessons, and my mom was always like, no, no, they're not useful tools, they're expensive pets, and you will have nothing to do with horses. And so that always made me really sad. But so we're not horse people, but we're also no strangers to farm accidents. So the fact that the first thing in the book that you learn about is there's accident, like, just sucked me in, because about, it was 8, 9, maybe 10 years ago, I don't remember, my papa was helping my cousin harvest some corn. Because my great uncle, his brother, had fallen off of a combine and injured himself.
Gosh, I've heard so many combine injury stories in my life. So, like, it's
they're dangerous machines. I mean, yeah. Farming is just a dangerous enterprise in general, and I don't think that people really understand that. But Papa was walking the field at the same time that my cousin was driving the combine, and Matt, my cousin, accidentally hit my papa, and his leg got caught in the corn head, and he eventually had to have it amputated. But it's kind of the same story, right? Like, waiting for the ambulance, hoping he doesn't bleed out. Like, he ended up sending a helicopter, and he had to be flown to the city. And like, I think that like rural people would really connect to that, whether they're horse people or not, like the understanding of caring for animals and plants, yeah, as the dangerous enterprise that it is. And so, like, I thought that opening was so like powerful and visceral, and just like it really, really sucked me in. And so I totally connected to that, even though we're not horse people.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and it makes you think too, like, what if this was the turn of the century? How would things be 100 years ago? And they would be really, really dicey.
Yeah, to say the least.
and And I imagine too, like I personally, everyone I know has some sort of disability. And maybe it's because all my friends are horse people and get injured like crazy. But it's something that isn't really represented a lot in books and the media is people who live with disability, and it's not something that's cured. It's just something that they live with throughout their life. And I could imagine that even more so, 100 years ago, the prevalence of disability was probably, much higher because modern medicine wasn't what it was. And so that's something also I wanted to showcase a lot in my book is normalizing disability, and also the idea of being sensitive to the needs of people with disabilities. Because I mean, and I think it's really nice when if you have friends who are thinking about what can I do to make this person more comfortable. I think it's nice, and I just would love to see that a little bit more in books and media.
And I think too, sort of I don't know, like being who you are and embracing who you are, even in your disability. Like Asta, I don't know how you would say it.
Yeah, Asta.
Asta.
Yeah.
Okay. I put like a disclaimer. My summary video is going to drop tomorrow. But I put like a disclaimer that like I am not from Scandinavia. I have no idea how to pronounce any of these words, but it didn't change the fact that I enjoyed the book, and so I think that that's okay,
Yeah.
But Asta's just mindset and her determination to be who she is, even though people see her the way that other people see her, as an outsider, as someone who's weird, somebody who looks weird, somebody who behaves weird, even though other people in the town see her that way, she loves who she is.
Yeah, but she still does fight. It's not a one path journey to like self-acceptance. She still struggles with things like guilt, right, and things like, who should I be grateful for? Should I be grateful for this person who is being nice to me, but seems like his motivation, she can't quite put a word on it, but when he says things like, aren't you grateful for how I overlook your flaws? Right. She's like, maybe I should be, but there's something about that makes me feel uncomfortable. So like navigating the way that people are putting their expectations on you, and guilt and social programming and all of that is something that she grapples with throughout the plot.
And I think that is really important to see someone doing, because it's something that people still have to do today.
Yeah.
But I just, those three characters, those three people, were just really, I don't know, they just were really well crafted. Like they were real to me. They were real to me, and I felt sad to leave them when I was done reading the book. And just the strength and resilience and willingness to push one another and also push society, and just the determination to figure out who they were and be who they were and accept themselves as who they were, I thought was a really, really important component of this book, and one that I really appreciated and enjoyed.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I like the characters too. I hope that people will read the book and want to spend more time with them. I have this idea in my head for like a sequel or like a follow-up book that would be like Gunnar and Fred's point of view, and it would be like alternate point of view between Gunnar and Fred. But of course, in order for something like that to happen, like the first book needs to do really well and all of that. So but yeah, that's brewing in my head, because I cannot, as an author, can't lead the characters.
Okay, so internet issues aside, we're going to try to soldier on. And I am curious about why you write, or why you became a writer.
Well, it's interesting because I originally, when I graduated high school and went to college, I wanted to be a filmmaker. And so I got my undergraduate degree in film and my master's degree in film. And I wrote a lot of screenplays, and I even made a film. And I just decided filmmaking is so expensive. It's so stressful. It's so much about a team experience where you might have this vision and then you have to like filter your vision through everyone else who's working on your piece. And it and especially for screenwriting, it's this half-made thing that only becomes real when it gets made into a film. And so after kind of not having a really great experience with my first endeavors in filmmaking, I decided I really wanted to be able to tell stories but have complete control over them. And novel writing really allows you to spend the time, like, whereas filmmaking, it's like rush, 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 you have to just get it done. Whereas with novel writing, you can spend years and years and years working on something, perfecting it, like working on making it your vision. And it's whatever stage of the process it's at, even if it's unpublished, it's still a book that people can read and enjoy and experience as a work of art. So I started writing this novel, and it's been a whole process that's taken many, many years. I started it, I think, in earnest in 2013 was like my first file. Like I found the date stamp for it. I was like, okay, my first like file was back then in 2013. And then I spent, I think, until 2014 on the first draft got done, and then revised, queried, got my first agent in 2017. So the whole revision process took a really long time. My first agent was unsuccessful in selling it. In 2018, I got my second agent. That agent took a year to eventually sell. And then from 2019 to 2021, that's when you're working with the publisher and doing developmental edits and copy edits and line edits and past pages and all of that. So I love, anyway, I love the just that you can spend time on something, work on making it good, and it's not dependent on so many other factors, like how much money you have and how many people, the quality of the people working on it, and whether you're able to communicate in the correct way to the people that are working on it. You just have complete control over it. And so I think I've kind of like found this as my method for storytelling.
That makes a lot of sense. What is your process like? So across all of those years, like ELA teachers, we talk a lot about the writing process and about brainstorming and collecting ideas and then drafting and revising. And so I'm just curious, everybody's process looks a little bit different. So what's your process like?
Yeah, I remember back in the day, like early on, I was making a Pinterest board of like aesthetic ideas for the book. And for this particular book, early on, I made like a board, like a poster board that had like little Post-it notes on it of like different scenes that would happen. Eventually, but the scenes that were on those Post-its never made it into like the final draft. The first draft was really a mess. It's unidentifiable from what eventually got published. I was just kind of finding my way. It's like a sandbox, and you're just like, does this work? Does this work? How does this happen? And I don't have a set time that I'm writing. I just kind of write when I feel like it. A big portion of this, though, was written when I was training horses full time. And I would get up like at 5 a.m. in the morning to start riding horses. And then I would get done, I think, around noon. And then from noon until the evening, I had a lot of free time. So I spent writing and drafting. And then in the evening, I taught my evening graphic design classes. So so that kind of gave me this gap during the day to really focus on the book, and that's where I got like a majority of it done. But then the revision process is just about like sending it to people, connecting with other writers online, and being like, here, can you read this? Like, does this make sense? Because a lot of the early drafts were people reading it and being like, I have no idea what's going on. Like, good to know, because you have these ideas and you're not quite sure if they're translating to other people just yet. So so a lot of drafting, and really the early draft was not even a dual point of view. It was like omniscient narrator. So I think I needed to kind of write just to tell myself the story, and then eventually I figured out, okay, it's going to be dual point of view between these two characters. And then I kind of started from scratch. And there are many times where I had a draft and then I really started from scratch. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to write this again, but this time better and more succinctly. And the opening pages I probably wrote them like 20 different times, completely different settings, completely different scenario in that opening chapter, until I finally found like the setting and the dynamic and the vibe and the plot points that now are in the first chapter. It really took about writing that about 20 times before I got it.
The dual perspective is really interesting. How did you decide that it was going to be Erland and Asta?
I thought really originally it would be a story about the Fuglestads, but I thought it would be really cool to tell it from two people who are not members of the Fuglestad family, and so we can learn about them through the point of view of two outsiders who, in a way, kind of idolize them. And the reason that they kind of idolize the Fuglestads is because they are also like outsiders in their community, and they also are kind of inspired by how they just do their own thing and they live their life, and they don't seem to have any desire to conform to the way things are done in town.
Yeah, it's a very Jacob's Room, Virginia Woolf kind of thing, like,
yeah,
we learn about Jacob through sort of his, and it's not the exact same, but we learn about Jacob from other people in the book. We don't learn about Jacob from Jacob.
Yeah.
And so that's a really interesting, I hadn't made that connection before, but now that you say that makes a lot of sense.
And Asta and Erland each see different sides to Erland, or to Gunnar. Hello. Asta and Erland each see different sides to Gunnar. And so that's interesting too. And the way Gunnar is with Asta is different than the way Gunnar is with Erland. And so that's fun too.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting interactions and sort of opportunities for readers to understand how perspective of someone or of a situation or of someone in a situation is really affected by the experiences that the person having the perspective has had.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another really powerful thing about this book, is that you can see sort of similar situations through different perspectives of people who have had different experiences. And there's some really powerful thinking that can happen through that.
Yeah, Asta has known Gunnar like his whole life, her whole life, practically since they were kids. And Erland is just kind of now starting to get to know Gunnar. And it's nice the way that Asta interacts with Gunnar is a little bit she kind of has the gloves off a little bit sometimes with him. She kind of like calls him on things a little bit more. Then Erland is going to be a little bit more sensitive and a little bit more cautious with him.
And I think that has something to do too with their own personalities.
Definitely. And it showcases their personality too, how they interact with Gunnar. It's a really fun dynamic.
It is.
Those three. Yeah.
It is. And it really showcases like how disposition, like who we are and like who we are in our dispositions impact the way that we interact with people in certain ways and how that gets received.
Yeah.
positively sometimes, maybe negatively other times, and how there's a community and family, especially for them, found family aspect to that I think is really beautiful and a really important part of the book.
Yeah. And they all help kind of heal each other in different ways too. And they're a different way of, you need friends that are not all the same.
Right.
Because you need the friend who's gonna be gentle with you. You need the friend who's gonna like push you a little bit, and having those different dynamics. You need the friend that's just gonna be silly with you too. And that who understands your sense of humor. And, that's something I think about too a lot. And I think also inspired a lot of the way that Gunnar and Erland and Asta interact is like with certain people, like I have a certain sense of humor that's a little bit more dark and a little bit more sarcastic. And there's certain friends who see that sense of humor, but then with other friends, they don't necessarily see that side to me because I don't want to necessarily offend them.
Yeah. And I think that actually connects with what we were saying too, with like the writing process, like figuring out what story you're actually telling by interacting with readers, and how what you have written is read through their perspectives, and how that helps them make meaning of the story. Mm-hmm. And then that feedback, mm-hmm. then helps you make a better
yeah.
story,
Feedback is so huge because there's, when you're drafting and you're sending out your work to people, you're going to get some people that say things like, this character is so mean, and other people like, I like that character. And so you have to then revise with the sense of, okay, there is this risk this character is going to come across as mean, and I don't want them to do that. So but people like the energy of whatever's happening with that character. So how can I allow the character to have that edge to them, but also then bring in explanation and narration and nuance that will make everyone else not hate the character, So so there's like whenever you read it, or you read feedback from other people, you get to see it from their lens, and then you get to okay, I've now seen your point of view. How can I bring in different little ingredients to make it something that's going to connect with different people?
And I think that whole process feels really intimidating and maybe almost annoying for young writers. Like,
yeah,
the whole idea, because there's this thinking around standardized testing that your first draft should be your best draft, and that should be it. And like, you shouldn't have to rewrite anything. And like, you sit down and you're like under the timer, and you have to produce. And so when I was in the classroom, students would be really frustrated about having to go back and rewrite things. But I think that all of the professional writers that I've talked to, even if they don't necessarily like the process, appreciate how it makes a story better, how it makes writing better to go through the process.
Yeah, I love revision. And if I just relied on my first draft, it literally would not make sense to anyone. And the first draft is so, it's called the garbage draft for a reason. It's like, I kind of have this idea and this idea and this idea. And then your revision is like, okay, how do I make this into like a story that it's going to engage people emotionally? And revision is my favorite thing. I've spent, so now like 2014 to 2000. So how many years is that? Like 7 years. We're basically revising the story. So it makes sense to people. And I think all feedback is valid. I've had feedback from people who told me like, cut this scene. And I was like, no, I don't want to cut that scene. I like that scene. And I've had, multiple people respond to it really well. And then after sitting with it a little while, you say, okay, I'm just going to cut it and just see what happens. And it's like this experimentation process. And when you do, it's like, oh, wow, actually, this works so much better without this scene here after all. So every bit of feedback is usually right. And even if someone is giving like vague feedback, like they'll say this part's boring, and another person says, I love this part. Well, that person that said that this part's boring is probably right about something not working there. And maybe it's a bit of information that they're needing, or maybe it's just the dialogue's too wordy and you just need to trim it down. But I really do think all feedback is relevant in some way.
Yeah. Even if it's hard to hear, or even if it's hard to stomach, and even if you resist it because you're like, no, like this is my darling, I think you're right. When you experiment with it and you follow the feedback and you see what it does, then it may send you down a completely different path. And that's hard too, like taking criticism is hard.
I really value it though. I mean, it's hard at first, but I'm not supposed to read my reader review, but I will say occasionally I do, and I learn so much, and I definitely actually apply the negative feedback that I get in writing my next book. Because then I know kind of, okay, what things are not connecting with certain people, even though, some people might be like, this is the greatest. There's always that one person that's like, it's not working for me. Okay, well, that's great, because then it gives you a chance to redo something, rethink about something in a way that will reach a wider audience.
So speaking of next books, do you have future projects in the works that you can talk about? I know sometimes you can't talk about it, but do you have stuff that you can and would like to talk about?
Yeah, I'm revising a magical book. It's also set in a isolated Scandinavian island, and it's about a family that's cursed, and at some point in their lives, every member of that family will transform into animals, and they don't know what causes it or when the transformation will take effect. And the book is told from the point of view of an orphan that's been taken in by the family. And the youngest son has begun his transformation, and the boy is determined to save this other boy from the transformation, and he has to learn sorcery. So it's got magic. It's very like contained because it's all in this little island, and it's a very rural setting. They raise sheep, and so my love for sheep will probably be in all my books.
And I think that's great. That's really fascinating that both of the books will be that there's something about the isolation, right?
Yeah.
Of a rural place on an island that is interesting. Yeah. What do you think draws you to those sorts of settings?
I think I'm a very introverted person. I am I'm not a big crowd type of person, although I do love living kind of in an urban setting like I am now. I'm a little isolated, and I'm kind of like back here in this little tree covered area in my little studio cottage. So I'm kind of an introverted person, and I think I'm drawn to settings that are out in the away from other people, and where there's a little bit of a loneliness, and I like it.
We'd call that the boonies.
Yeah.
The boonies. But I think that there's something interesting too about how isolation frames each of the stories. It's like you sort of look at the sort of insular aspects of the town, and there's not as much, not necessarily like white noise, but there's just not as much interaction between outside and inside, so you can sort of focus more on the inside. Not to say that one is more valuable than the other, but I think in this instance especially, like the fact that the Fugelsats live so far outside of town, and they also live so far outside of society because they're the heathens. And I think it's interesting the way that you use place to sort of almost as a character in the book, but also as a frame. And I think that there's a lot of interesting thinking that can happen there for readers.
Yeah. The theme of exile is also something that's in the book I'm writing now, and in the book that in The Reckless Kind. So exiles, like, not fitting in, not conforming, being different. I think it's just a universal theme that teenagers can relate to.
And I think there's a lot of overlap
in groups and out groups.
The way that you think about queerness, the way that you think about disability, the way that you think about how all of these different layers of identity interact in these particular places. And then within that, like the sort of national narrative of rural places being outside to cities and city people being outsiders to rural spaces. I think that there's a lot of transfer that can happen there, that in really interesting ways.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also kind of thinking about the idea of people who are outsiders are often people who acknowledge the full spectrum of human experience in themselves. Like, queer people acknowledge the whole spectrum of gender and sexual identities, and disabled people who are proclaiming themselves as disabled or identifying themselves as disabled are identifying the whole range of ability and disability. Whereas like the generic population often denies sometimes that the nuances of identity, because you would think in the generic population there are a lot of people who have disabilities who maybe are not acknowledging it, or there's people who push back against gender and sexual identity restrictions and maybe who don't acknowledge it. And it's in many ways those who are outsiders are acknowledging things that the insiders tend to not acknowledge, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's almost as though, when you are on the outside, you understand human nature and human experience and the nuance of humanity in some ways a little bit better than those who are on the inside.
Okay, so I really only have one more question.
Okay, cool, awesome.
Okay, so if we can, hopefully our connection lasts long enough to get through that.
Yeah.
But my last question is, a lot of what I do, I'm trying to inspire young folks, especially young rural folks, to tell their stories, to tell rural stories, whether they happen in a US context or whether they mirror their own experiences, but just to make rural more visible, right?
Right.
And to help them understand that that's a worthwhile pursuit, that is something that is good and is worth doing, and that they have a story to tell. And so what sort of advice do you have for aspiring young writers?
Okay, so my advice to young writers is write what feels real to you, write what you enjoy writing. Don't pay attention to the trends or what people are buying or what is going on right now. If you write what is real to you and you work on it, you make it as good as it can possibly be, it will find its audience. And the process of getting an agent and getting a publisher, you're gonna hit a lot of rejections. I also got rejected a ton, and just keep on making your work as good as it can be. Send it out there, and don't let the rejections get you down. Just keep on sending it out there, and you will find the right agent for you, the right publisher for you. Just be persistent and keep at it. And don't give up, because it can be a little bit disheartening at times if you when you get those rejections, but understand that's just part of the process. Aim for 100 rejections. And every time, though, that you do get a little bit of feedback from someone, use that as an opportunity to do a revision and make it even better. So I hope that helps.
Okay, well, on that fantastic pep talk and inspiring note, we'll go ahead and kiss our internet issues goodbye and say
yay
and say goodbye. But it was so lovely to meet you. It was so wonderful to talk about the book. The book was amazing. I loved it so much, and I hope that all of my audience members, my I don't even know, this little community that watches this show, I hope everybody picks it up because it's so good and they won't be disappointed if they do.
Thank you. And you guys can find me on www.carlyheathauthor.com, and I'm on Twitter at Carly L. Heath, and on Instagram at Carly Lynn Heath. And the book is The Reckless Kind, available at bookstores everywhere.